Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In the first half of the 20th century, Turkey and Iran dreaded their common northern border with the Soviet Union and allied themselves with the West in general and the United States in particular. But now, though some of their concerns remain aligned, including the Kurdish communities, Iraq, Syria, and Azerbaijan, their interests are more and more in conflict and their policies may involve them in a head-on collision. Is it a foregone conclusion or avoidable? To analyze this topic, we're joined from Turkey by Mr. Yusuf Erim, who is TRT World Editor-at-Large. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed, and with us here in the studio is our TV7 analyst and host of Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments pertaining to this unique relationship.
By latest, you mean you don't want me to go back to the proud and ancient civilizations with their long history, both separately and vis-a-vis each other. Fine. So even though Turkey and Iran have a common border, perhaps now, this time of the year, it's not frozen and one can cross over. There usually is some snow there in wintertime. This is not the front line between these two countries. They are both involved in one way or another in Syria, but right now the front is in Iraq or in the northern part, the Kurdish part, and it has to do with the pro-Iranian militias and the Turkish armed forces battling the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist organization, because the northern part of Iraq, where there are also American and coalition bases, is now the place where friction is most evident between the various interests. So right now, there are mostly verbal attacks between the sides. We should also, of course, consider the fact that Iran is perhaps the most powerful Shiite nation, while Turkey is a powerful Sunni nation, and there is a basic tension between the two parts of the Muslim religion. So all in all, we are in a period of escalation. You asked whether further escalation is avoidable. It is, but it will take a lot of diplomacy.
Indeed, and to better shed light on all of this, we'll try and understand both perspectives to this conflict, if you will. But Mr. Erim, we'll start with you. What is the Turkish perspective on the current situation vis-a-vis Iran?
Well, we have to separate relations with Iran from bilateral relations between Tehran and Ankara and both countries' power projection into the region. Now, when we look at bilateral relation, obviously the economy, bilateral trade, the very recent launching of the Istanbul, Tehran, Islamabad train, we see positive developments on that front, especially economically. But once we get to power projection in the region, especially in Iraq and Syria, we see that both countries have proxies in the region. Turkey has very serious national security concerns, especially lately in Iraq with the PKK. And we see slow cooperation between the PKK and Shia militia groups, most namely the Hashd al-Shabi, and likely operation by Turkey into the Sinjar region of Iraq to quell these national security concerns. Now, we know that just a couple of weeks ago, Turkey had launched an operation into Gara against PKK operatives and terrorists in the region. And part of that operation, unfortunately, 13 Turkish prisoners were executed by the PKK. Now, this definitely didn't go down well in Ankara. And Turkey now wants to broaden its counterterrorism operations into Sinjar. And Turkey has been cooperating with its regional allies in Baghdad, in Erbil. We've seen comments by Masroor Barzani talking about the PKK taking advantage of the KRG's goodwill in occupying land and that their presence is no longer tolerated. We've seen the Iraqi Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, also give warm comments. So one could assume these could be perceived as green lights for Turkey to enter Sinjar, which is going to create even more tension between Turkey and the Shiite militia in that group, who are now housing and aiding and abetting PKK, most namely Hashd al-Shabi, Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, Harakat Hezbollah Nujaba. So these groups are definitely going to cause problems for Turkey. And the latest reports are saying that there's about 15,000 Hashd al-Shabi in Sinjar.
Indeed. Mr. Javedanfar, how about the Iranian perspective to this whole ordeal? Where does Iran perceive Turkey to be a challenge to its interests in the region?
First and foremost, Iran does see Turkey as a competitor, but Iran's priority right now is to reduce tensions. There are some tensions and clashes of interests in Azerbaijan. We saw recently when regarding Azerbaijan, Mr. Erdogan quoted a poem which Azerbaijanis sometimes cite when Azerbaijan was divided in half between Iranian Azerbaijan and independent Azerbaijan, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. He raised a lot of anger through that. There was now recently the Twitter spat between the Iranian ambassador to Iraq and the Turkish government, which led to both governments to call the other side's ambassador. But I have to say, this is not something that Iran wants to escalate. Iran does not want to escalate the current tensions to escalate, although there are tensions. Iran has got other issues on its plate regarding the sanctions, regarding issues with Saudi Arabia, with Israel. And of course, Turkey is a very important supplier. Turkey is Iran's link to Europe, basically. It's the land corridor to Europe for Iran runs through Turkey. Turkey is a very important source for import of goods from Europe via land. Turkey is a customer for Iran's gas, although Turkey is buying now 30% less gas than it did in 2019. Still, this is very important for Iran. And last but not least, Turkey is an important market for Iranians, including regime officials, who want to invest their money abroad in real estate. Iranians, after Iraqis, are the second biggest investors, Middle Eastern investors in Turkish real estate. And the Iranian regime officials who have real estate in Turkey certainly don't want relations with Mr. Erdogan to deteriorate too much.
Indeed. So, Mr. Oren, why would Iran continue to encourage its Shiite militias to go against Turkish interests and endanger Turkish security or national security interests along the Turkish border at a time when it's so concerned about the way Turkey feels about this relationship?
Well, if it will only be so simple. And we all grew up on the legacy of the Cold War, where you had two camps. Yes, you had non-aligned in the middle, but basically you were either with us or against us. And what we see in the Middle East, especially over the last decade, the so-called Arab Spring, is that you can have Turkey and Iran along with Russia as part of the Astana process. At least nominally, they are on the same page regarding the future of Syria. But simultaneously, you have confrontations inside Syria or outside, as we have right now in Iran. And as Yusuf mentioned, Kataib Hezbollah and others are, of course, the enemies of the Americans. They are shelling the Americans. The Americans are striking back, killing their leader along with Qasem Soleimani. But right now, in northern Iraq, they are apparently on the same side. At least if you look at it as a double negative. So it's very difficult to see the nuances and say on a particular day, on a particular issue, whether neighbors, such powerful neighbors as Turkey and Iran, are friends or foes?
Mr. Erim, you spoke about Sinjar, Turkey's intentions to expand potentially in the near future its operation against PKK forces there, which are operating not only against Turkey but also against the local Kurdistan regional government and the Baghdad's central government, of course, came to an arrangement together with Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar when he visited there about a month ago, and they discussed the possibilities of really joining forces in pushing that further. How do you see the Iranians actually somehow thwarting Turkey's attempts to widen its influence in order to secure its southern border?
Well, this is how I see it. First thing, it's important to understand that the Kurdish region in northern Iraq is not a homogeneous region. You have two power centers. You have Erbil and you have Suleimania, and you have two rival parties that have different outlooks towards Shia militia and the PKK. In Erbil, you have the KDP that looks very warmly on Turkey, that looks at the PKK and Shia militia as a occupying force, as a nuisance, as a hostile actor. Then you have the PUK, the Talibanis, who welcome the presence of Shia militia, who have close relations with the PKK. So we have to always keep that in the back of our mind when we're talking about the KRG. Now, how do I expect the Shia militia to act if Turkey does enter Sinjar? Well, judging from the statements of many of the leaders of these small Iran-backed groups, they've been calling for engagement with Turkish troops if they enter Sinjar. But we have to realize that talk is very, very cheap, and trying to motivate these forces against Turkey will be a tough task. Taking on NATO caliber, NATO standard, a standing army with drone and air forces who has only a 70-kilometer distance and very easy to set up a logistic line to Sinjar is very different than fighting other non-state actors or terror groups like Daesh. Obviously, Turkey's going to come with very, very big firepower. And if we've seen how Turkey has reacted in the past to Shia militia that have tried to engage Turkish proxies or help groups that threaten Turkey's national security, very simple, the example in Idlib when Turkey hit many Kataib Hezbollah forces and other Hezbollah units belonging to Lebanon, and it landed a very devastating blow on those units. And we could see from the amount of casualties that were returning to Lebanon, while it was not very advertised in the media, that Turkey did strike a very big blow to Hezbollah units there. So Turkey has shown a risk toleration that, if necessary, it will treat Shia militia as legitimate targets if it's standing in the way.
Mr. Javedanfar, what am I missing here? When we're talking about Iranian foreign policy in the region, obviously it has a clear strategic interest to establish a corridor or to maintain a corridor between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The confrontation now with Turkey and finding itself in a course of collusion with Turkish interests in those same areas may put all of its interests in jeopardy. How is it now maneuvering in order to avoid such a confrontation, which you stated correctly earlier, is not in the interest of Tehran?
It really depends. I think there's a chance that the Hashd Sha'bi may not even engage the Turkish forces. We have to remember that Turkey has a distinct advantage in its UAV force, which we saw was one of the critical success factors in the recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Hashd Sha'bi does not have the UAV force to fight it. Turkey has Air Force F-4 Phantoms, they have F-16. Hashd Sha'bi does not have an Air Force. Also, let's remember that when Daesh was in Mosul, I think when Qasem Soleimani was alive, they attacked Mosul 3 times or 4 times, and they still couldn't break through against Daesh. And only they broke through after the Americans provided them with air support. So I think it is possible that Hashd Sha'bi may not even engage the Turkish forces if Turkey invades. And if they do, and if there is going to be a clash, I think for Iran, it's going to be, they're going to try to reduce tensions as much as possible. We also have to remember that Mr. Erdogan is the best choice that Iran has in Turkey. Iranians are very, very fearful of the Gulenists. Fatullah Gulen was vehemently anti-Iran, the way the Iranians saw him. And this is why when there was that coup against Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Zarif was on the phone the whole night to Mr. Erdogan, trying to make sure that nothing's happened to Mr. Erdogan, because if the Gulenists win and the Gulenists come to power, Iran's relations with Turkey would be very severe. And the other alternatives, the other Turkish nationalists also, they don't have a very good view of Iran. So all in all, I think it will be in the interest of Iran, first of all, to avoid a clash. But if there is a clash, to make sure afterwards that tensions with Turkey are reduced.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to understand regional perspectives to this possible collusion as well as international ones. How does Israel view this on the one hand, as well as, of course, Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region who might not be in the most favorable of relations currently with Turkey, but at the same time confronting Iran in certain areas would constitute a mutual interest and very significant interest at that. And at the same time, of course, the Biden administration, and at the time when the Hashd-e-Sha'bi are also targeting U.S.-led coalition installations, attacking American forces in different areas throughout Iraq. Of course, the Biden administration, alongside its will to return into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the nuclear deal with Iran, at the same time, it wants to root out the Iranian influence from Iraq and is very vocal about it. How is that actually aligned with now backing its NATO ally, Turkey?
So, as you can see, behind Meir's back, you have the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. And behind Yusuf's back, you have mostly the Mediterranean, along with other spheres of interest and influence of Turkey's. So, obviously, there are 2 points here. The Turks were allied with Israel and may become allies again. There is the beginning of a rapprochement. It's nothing grand yet, but there's some promise there. And as you say, Iran is Israel's mortal enemy, and Turkey could revert to a more neutral stand or perhaps even a friendlier stand. So if it comes to a clash between Turkey and Iran, obviously Israel would love to see Turkey win. Now, additionally, the Turkish policy is defensive in nature, much like the Israeli policy in Syria. Both the Turks and the Israelis hit proxies or militias when they try to entrench themselves in a country adjacent to their own. The pro-Iranian militias in southern Syria and the Kurdish terrorists in northern Syria. So there is a similarity there. The Iranians are offensive, not defensive. When the Iranians are helping their own proxies in Iraq, they have designs on Baghdad itself. They want to control Iraq and Iraqi policy. They may want to keep a very tenuous link between Baghdad and Erbil. They don't want Iraq to disintegrate, because then Kurdistan could become independent and then have some other regions in Syria and perhaps serve as a magnet for Kurds in Turkey. But the Iranians do want to control Iraq. It is not in Turkey's interest. So if I had to sum it all up, if it comes down to a showdown between Iran and Turkey, Israel will silently root for Turkey.
Indeed, and maybe not too silent. But Mr. Erim, I'd like to ask you specifically about the possibility of a collision. In the case, and even though we don't like too much of those kind of analogies, but in the case of a frontal confrontation between Turkey and Hashd-e-Sha'bi, which is clearly the majority of them are Iranian proxies or backed or controlled by Iran, for that matter. Would Iran be spared in such a confrontation if it would cost in Turkish lives?
Well, we have to remember, as I said before, the example from Idlib. Iran and Turkey have been able to compartmentalize what happens outside of the bilateral relationship in Syria. So I see no reason why what happens in the spirit of Iraq or in the Iraqi theater will not be compartmentalized either. Now, maybe Iraq might be a little more strategic for Iran, being a border country, and Iran being much more entrenched in Iraq, having a much bigger investment over there over the years, ever since the fall of Saddam. But I do think that both countries will maintain correspondence throughout, even if there is a confrontation between Turkish troops and Hashd al-Shaabi fighters. So I don't think that that'll change anything. But just to get a broader perspective of the region, when we look at America and their maximum pressure or their policies towards Iran, which happens to change according to a president, see maximum pressure, you see Iran nuclear deal. You see maximum pressure, you see a return to the nuclear deal. You look at Israeli policies, which is basically airstrikes. While they use hard power very, very effectively, at the end of the day, these are superficial airstrikes, which you take out Iranian fighters, but for every one that's killed, 5 come back in its place. Saudi Arabia has a problem even dealing with the Houthis in Yemen, to let alone deal with the much bigger Iranian proxies like Hashd al-Shaabi or Hezbollah. So when any type of contain Iran policy in the region, or anyone who views Iran as a threat, Turkey is the most effective country in this aspect. You look at what's happening in Azerbaijan, you look at what's happening in Syria, you look at what's happening in Iraq. While Turkey did not lay out these policies specifically to contain Iran, they are having the side effect of containing Iran on multiple fronts right now. And now we're seeing quite possibly an operation into Sinjar, again, not specifically aimed at containing Iran, aimed at the PKK, but again, the side effects pushing Iran back. And what Turkey brings to the table, as President Erdogan had said, that his plans are to stay in Sinjar until stability is restored, not only pushing back Shiite militia units, but mixing hard power, soft power, and being able to bring stability into the region and being able to push that Shiite influence out for long term from these areas.
Indeed. Mr. Javedanfar, how do you see Iran getting out of all of this situation at this stage? Would it try to rein in the Shiite militias from acting as it has done during the transition period of the Trump administration to the Biden administration? It managed, in general, to rein in its Shiite militias to a certain extent. Do you see this happening again now?
With regards to Turkey or with regards to America?
With regard to Turkey.
It is possible. It is more possible that Iran would rein in the Shia militia with regards to Turkey than with regards to America. With regards to Mr. Biden, I'm less optimistic. With regards to Mr. Erdogan, I'm more optimistic that Iran would perhaps contain this situation. But another factor that we have to take into consideration regarding Iran-Turkey relationship is that although Iran is the country that saved Mr. Assad, it was the first country in 2011 to come to his help. They brought Hezbollah. For 4 years, it was Iran that was protecting Mr. Bashar al-Assad. Turkey is winning the economic game in Syria. And this makes the Iranians very angry. This is another advantage which Turkey has over Iran in the general balance of power competition between them in the region. Also in Iraq, despite Iran, Hashd al-Shaabi, despite Iran having such incredible influence in Iraq, also in Iraq, the Iranians are very dismayed that Iraqi consumers and Iraqi building contractors would prefer to work with Turkish companies than Iranian companies. And as we see this happening in Syria and in Iraq, it's very likely that soon we're also going to see this in Azerbaijan. The areas that the Azerbaijanis recently captured, they're going to rebuild them. It is, again, we're going to see Turkey's far stronger economy, especially its construction sector, also appearing there. So I think as part of this balance of power competition, it's not just a question of Iran having the upper hand as in terms of proxies. Although Turkey does not have its proxies, or if there are Turkish proxies, they're not as strong as the Shiite proxies that Iran has. Turkey's economic prowess and influence also gives it much influence, and this is something that Turkey is likely to use as leverage in its dealings with Iran.
Mr. Erim, in one sentence, is the conflict for Sinjar inevitable?
It's not inevitable, but it's becoming more and more likely by the day. Just very quickly to add, Turkey has a lot of carrots in its basket, as our other guests said, whether it be water, whether it be investment. And what we've seen Iran do in Iraq, they've only taken, they haven't given, but Turkey will be investing. It has invested in the KRG, it's investing in Iraq, and it comes with a lot more carrots in its basket, which make for very, very good soft power and good relations.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
The only power we haven't talked about is Russia. And there have been instances in the past where Putin tried to reach a compromise, or at least to preside over a regional summit. One may see Putin inviting Erdogan and Rouhani, or perhaps on the foreign minister level, a sort of a mini summit in Moscow in order to resolve the conflict.
And you think that the diplomatic course would be ultimately not a better option, but a more likely option?
Unfortunately, usually shots are fired first, and then diplomacy comes in.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, and I would like to thank our distinguished guests, Mr. Yusuf Erim and Mr. Meir Javedanfar, for being part of today's program. And I'd like to thank our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, as well, for being part of today's panel. And also you, I'd like to thank all of our viewers, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.